Last spring, a wheat farmer named Mehmet in Konya province did something he had done every season for 30 years. He walked the edge of his field at dawn, checked the soil, checked the sky, and then walked back to his farmhouse satisfied. The crop looked clean. The stalks were strong. The season was going to be good. 3 weeks later, an inspector from the Darim v. Ormanbakan Ligi arrived at his gate. Not because of anything Mehmet had planted. Because of what his neighbor had planted 400 meters away, on the other side of a crumbling stone wall, in a garden that had been growing the same way for generations. By the time the inspector left, Mehmet's neighbor had received a formal citation. The crop in question, something you could find in home gardens across the Aegean, something sold in bazaars, something with a history in Anatolian soil stretching back centuries, had to be removed within 30 days. Not because it was poisonous, not because it was invasive, because it was a biological bridge, a living highway for a fungal disease that could travel invisibly from that garden to Mehmet's field, through the air, on the wind, on the legs of an insect, and wipe out an entire harvest before a single visible symptom appeared on a single stalk. Mehmet had never heard of the buffer zone law. Most farmers haven't. Most people growing these crops in their gardens right now have no idea that within 500 meters of certified agricultural land, what they are doing is not gardening. It is a legal liability. Welcome to the Anatolian Peasant Farmers channel. Today we are counting down 10 crops, some beloved, some ancient, some sold openly in every pazar from Istanbul to Diyarbakir, that Turkish agricultural law has drawn a hard line against. A literal, measured line in the soil. Not here. Not within 500 meters. Not without a permit. Not without consequences. Some of these plants have been growing in Anatolian gardens since before the Ottoman Empire existed. The Darim v. Ormanbakan Ligi, Turkey's Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry, has classified every one of them as a phytosanitary threat, a disease vector, or an ecological hazard serious enough to require buffer zone enforcement, mandatory eradication orders, or outright cultivation bans. From a vine that carries a rust fungus capable of destroying an entire province's wheat crop, to a fruit tree that hosts a moth whose larvae cost Turkish farmers over 200 million lira in a single season. And wait until we get to the one the Turkish government once actively distributed to rural cooperatives, before scientists discovered it was quietly spreading a disease with no cure. The garden in Anatolia was never as innocent as it looked. Let's get into it. Turkey's citrus industry is worth over $1 billion annually. The Cukurova Plain and the Mediterranean coastline between Mersin and Antalya are among the most productive citrus-growing regions on Earth. And somewhere along that coastline right now, a citrus tree that nobody in Turkey ever intended to eat is spreading into the undergrowth, forming walls of thorns 2 meters tall and refusing every attempt to remove it. Poncirus trifoliata, UC Yaprocli portacle, the three-leaved orange, looks like a citrus tree that has been slightly wrong about itself. The leaves grow in threes, which is unusual for the Rutaceae family. The fruit is golf ball-sized, covered in fine fuzz, loaded with seeds and barely any juice. The flavor so aggressively bitter that it makes the face contract involuntarily. The essential oils in the peel smell unmistakably of citrus. The tree itself is armored, thorns up to 8 centimeters long, dense enough to stop a person from pushing through. Nobody planted it to eat it. Poncirus was introduced to Turkey as a rootstock, the underground half of a grafted citrus tree. Its extraordinary cold hardiness surviving. Temperatures that destroy standard citrus varieties made it invaluable to growers in areas at the frost-line edge of the Cukurova and Antalya regions from the mid-20th century onward. Commercial oranges and lemons grew on Poncirus roots across the entire Mediterranean coast. The fruit above the graft was the product. The root below was the infrastructure. The problem is what happens when Poncirus seeds fall outside the orchard boundary. It naturalizes aggressively. It grows from seed without assistance. The thorns make mechanical removal dangerous. Cut it to the ground, and it regrows from the root system within a single growing season. By the 2000s, feral Poncirus populations had established themselves along roadsides, forest edges, and abandoned agricultural land across Mersin, Adana, and Hatay provinces. Turkish Forestry Service reports from 2009 to 2012 documented it displacing native maquis shrubland in protected natural areas directly adjacent to the citrus orchards whose roots it had escaped from. Regional agricultural directorates in Mersin and Adana began issuing advisories against new planting outside certified rootstock programs in 2013. Formal restrictions were codified by 2016 under Invasive Alien Species Management Guidelines aligned with EU Regulation 1143/2014. Poncirus trifoliata cannot be sold or planted outside licensed nursery programs in the southern coastal provinces. And yet it remains legally required as rootstock in the orchards growing directly beside the land where it is banned as a weed. The same tree, the same root system, the same seeds falling from the same branches, legal on one side of an orchard fence, classified as an invasive species on the other. The Poncirus arrived with credentials. It performed exactly the function it was brought in to perform. Then it simply kept going. It never needed permission to begin. It certainly did not ask for permission to spread. It arrived in Anatolia in the 16th century from the Americas, aboard Ottoman trade vessels returning from North Africa. For 400 years, it was considered harmless, a roadside curiosity, a food source for goats, a living fence on Mediterranean smallholdings. Then ecologists measured what it had been quietly doing to Aegean and Mediterranean coastal ecosystems since the day it arrived. The prickly pear, hint in Syrian Turkish, literally Indian fig, grows in dense, impenetrable pads along the Aegean and Mediterranean coastline. The fruit is actually edible, sweet, delicate, slightly melon-like, sold by street vendors in coastal towns every August. If you have walked a Turkish seafront in summer, you have almost certainly passed someone selling it from a cart, the deep red-orange flesh halved and offered on a stick, one of the small, unremarkable pleasures of a country with an extraordinary food culture. The pads are another matter. They carry two types of spine, large, visible thorns and invisible glochids, microscopic barbed needles that detach on contact and embed in skin, eyes, and mucous membranes, causing inflammation that can last for weeks. The plant is not aggressive in the way a predator is aggressive. It is aggressive in the way a bureaucratic obstruction is aggressive, passive, structural, nearly impossible to resolve once it has established itself in the wrong place. The ecological mechanism is displacement. Opuntia grows faster than native Mediterranean maquis shrubland species, Kermes oak, lentisk, myrtle, and forms impenetrable monocultures that shade out native ground flora, collapse native insect habitat, and block access to coastal cliff breeding sites used by native reptile and bird populations. On the Aegean Islands and the Antalya coastal strip, Opuntia has replaced native vegetation on an estimated 15 to 20% of uncultivated coastal land. For centuries of slow advance, pad by unnoticed pad, while everyone was eating the fruit and feeding the goats and thinking nothing of it. In 2014, Turkey's Sevrivi Sihirslikbakanligi, the Ministry of Environment, formally classified Opuntia ficus indica as an invasive species under Turkish environmental regulation, mandating impact assessments for any intentional new planting and removal programs in protected coastal and nature reserve zones. Removal has proven nearly impossible. Mechanical clearing allows regrowth from any surviving root fragment. The glochid spines make manual removal dangerous without specialist equipment. Herbicide application in coastal zones is restricted under groundwater protection rules. The 2014 classification was not the beginning of a solution. It was the formal acknowledgement that the problem had already won. Commercial cultivation for fruit production continues legally on agricultural land. The plant that is classified as an ecological threat in a protected nature reserve is simultaneously harvested for street food 50 meters away. 400 years. Not once asked to leave. Not once particularly concerned about being asked. The Turkish government promoted it. Agricultural extension agents recommended it for erosion control. Southeastern farmers planted it along riverbanks by the thousand across the gap, the Güneydoğu Anadolu Projesi, the largest irrigation development project in Turkish history, through the 1980s and 1990s. The reports said it was a solution. Then the Euphrates tributaries started changing. The quince sava is one of Anatolia's most ancient cultivated fruits, referenced in Hittite agricultural texts, and possibly one of the original fruits of the Fertile Crescent. The flesh is hard and astringent raw, transforming completely when cooked into a golden, honey-scented preserve. Turkish avar reseli, quince jam, sits on the breakfast table of nearly every Turkish home in winter. The tree is beautiful, white-pink blossom in spring, large golden fruit in October, branches heavy enough to bend toward the water it was planted beside. A government recommending it for riverbank stabilization was not an unreasonable decision. Quince is deep-rooted, fast-establishing, productive, and culturally beloved. On paper, it was exactly the right plant for the job. The problem was feral dispersal. Quince planted for erosion stabilization along gap irrigation canals and Euphrates tributary banks established wild populations faster than anyone had modeled. Feral quince forms dense, thorny monocultures along riparian corridors, outcompeting native riparian vegetation, tamarisk, poplar, willow, that provide habitat for migratory birds and native fish populations. The Fire River Basin showed measurable narrowing of channel width in affected zones by the early 2000s, attributed in part to sediment trapping by feral quince root systems expanding into the water margin. The tree that had been planted to hold the bank in place was holding it too well, contracting it, redirecting it, slowly converting a river corridor into a quince monoculture that nothing else could penetrate. Environmental impact assessments conducted by Heron University's agricultural faculty between 2003 and 2006 documented feral quince spread across 3 Euphrates tributary corridors and recommended removal from designated riparian buffer zones. The Darim v. Orman-Bakanligi issued regional advisories in 2008 restricting new quince planting within 200 meters of designated watercourses in gap provinces, including Şanlıurfa, Gaziantep, and Adıyaman. Removal programs have since been conducted at considerable public expense. The same government that recommended planting it has spent the years since paying to dig it out. Cultivated quince remains fully legal, commercially important, promoted as a heritage agricultural product. The restriction targets only feral and self-seeded populations in protected riparian zones, which is to say, it targets exactly the populations that exist because the government put them there. The quince did not misbehave. It did precisely what quince does. It established, it spread, it held the ground it was given, and then it held more ground than anyone had intended to give it. The government called it a solution. The river disagreed. The black mulberry did not contain alcohol. It could not be fermented into wine without considerable additional effort. And yet, during the most severe periods of Ottoman alcohol prohibition, black mulberry orchards across Anatolia were inspected, regulated, and in some urban areas ordered destroyed, because what their juice could become was enough to make it dangerous. The black mulberry, karadut, is one of Anatolia's most ancient fruits. The trees live for centuries. Some specimens in rural Anatolian villages are believed to be over 500 years old, their gnarled trunks wider than a man's reach, their root systems older than any administrative boundary drawn around them. The berries stain everything they touch, fingers, lips, cloth, with a deep, almost violent purple. The flavor is intensely sweet and tart simultaneously, unlike any other fruit grown in this soil. Anatolian villages harvest them by spreading sheets beneath the branches and shaking. The berries fall in a purple rain. The problem was mulberry wine, dutluk, or dutrakisi, which non-Muslim communities, particularly Armenian and Greek populations across Anatolia, produced in significant quantities from black mulberry must. During periods of strict Islamic governance, the production and sale of all fermentable fruit products, including mulberry, was subject to state inspection. Sultan Murad IV, who reigned from 1623 to 1640, and who, according to contemporary accounts, personally enforced alcohol bans with a severity that extended to execution, ordered inspections of urban mulberry orchards for unlicensed fermenting operations. The mulberry was not wine, but it was the raw material for wine. In the hands of communities, the state was already watching. Ottoman court records from the 1630s document the destruction of mulberry orchards in Istanbul's Galata district, historically the center of the city's non-Muslim winemaking communities, following enforcement of Murad IV's prohibition. The orchards were not destroyed because of anything inherent to the mulberry. They were destroyed because of who owned them, what those owners were known to do with the fruit, and what the state had decided to make impossible. The prohibition was never absolute or permanent. It was lifted and reinstated across different reigns, tightened and loosened according to the political temperature of each sultan's court. The mulberry orchards of Anatolia survived into the Republican era. The formal dissolution of Islamic alcohol law as state policy came with the Tanzimat reforms and definitively with the 1923 republic. Black mulberry is fully legal in Turkey today. Dut pekmezi, mulberry molasses, is a protected traditional food product. The trees that survived the Galata inspections are still standing in some cases, their trunks carrying 5 centuries of a history that the official record only partially captured. The mulberry was never the threat. It was simply growing in the wrong hands, in the wrong district, in the wrong century. That was enough. Turkey is the birthplace of the figure. The Aegean town of Aydin grows the saralop, the finest dried fig in the world, with a geographical indication protection that rivals champagne in its legal weight. It has been cultivated in this valley for at least 6,000 years. And for the past 60, the fig's own wild ancestor has been systematically eradicated from the irrigation deltas that made that cultivation possible. The wild Capri fig, Yabani insur, is not edible in the way its cultivated cousins are. The flesh is sparse, seedy, bitter. It produces no commercial fruit worth harvesting. But it is the biological engine without which commercial fig cultivation cannot exist, because it houses the fig wasp, Blastophagacines, the sole pollinator of the entire ficus genus. The fig wasp completes its entire life cycle inside the Capri fig. It is born inside it, mates inside it, and emerges carrying the pollen that fertilizes the cultivated saralop hanging in the orchards nearby. Without wild Capri fig trees within range, commercial fig orchards cannot achieve caprification, the pollination process that determines whether a fig becomes the finest dried fruit in the Mediterranean or drops from the branch empty. The farmers of Aydin have known this for centuries. They manage it deliberately, cutting branches of Capri fig laden with emerging wasps and hanging them among their cultivated trees at precisely the right moment in the pollination window. The relationship between the wild tree and the commercial orchard is not accidental. It is ancient, understood, and carefully maintained. The problem emerged as large-scale irrigation agriculture expanded through the Bayak Menderes and Gediz River deltas in the 1950s and 1960s. Wild Capri fig trees growing along irrigation canal banks were identified as hosts for a secondary threat, fig mosaic virus, transmitted by the Assyria ficus areophyid mite. The wild trees were acting as a permanent disease reservoir, reinfecting commercial saralop orchards season after season through a mite that moved invisibly between the two populations. The pollinator host and the disease reservoir were the same tree. In 1962, the Turkish Ministry of Agriculture issued phytosanitary clearance orders for wild Capri fig eradication within 500-meter buffer zones of certified saralop production areas across Aydin, Izmir, and Mughal provinces. The contradiction was immediately apparent to the farmers who received the orders. Remove the tree that carries the wasp your orchard cannot survive without, because the same tree carries a disease your orchard cannot survive either. The state's solution was to replace wild stock with certified disease-free Capri fig orchards, managed by the Aydin insur Arasterma Institusu under controlled caprification programs. The wild tree was not eliminated. It was nationalized. The wasp was not lost. It was administered. Wild capri fig planting within protected cerealop zones remains restricted to this day. The fig that built this valley's identity survives because the state decided to manage its own pollinator. The wild ancestor is still out there, under license. For over 300 years, the Anatolian poppy field was not a scandal. It was a pharmacy, a trade good, and a lifeline for rural farming families in Afyonkarahisar, Kütahya, and Isparta. The Ottoman Empire supplied medicinal opium to the entire world. Then the world decided that was a problem, and Turkey paid the price. The opium poppy blooms in white, purple, and deep burgundy across the chalky limestone plateaus of western Anatolia. The seed capsule hashish tozu yields both the narcotic latex and the culinary poppy seed central to Turkish bread, borek, and pastry traditions stretching back generations. Villages in Afyonkarahisar province organized their entire agricultural calendar around the poppy for centuries. The smell at harvest is faintly sweet, vegetal, unmistakable, a scent so embedded in the landscape of western Anatolia that it became part of the region's identity, inseparable from the soil that produced it. The compound at the center is morphine, and by chemical conversion, heroin. Ottoman and early Republican Turkey operated licensed poppy cultivation openly, supplying legitimate pharmaceutical manufacturers across Europe. The same supply chains, however, were exploited by illicit processors. By the post-World War II period, Anatolian opium was a documented source in the global heroin trade, not because Turkish farmers were producing heroin, but because the raw material they legally produced was being diverted after it left their fields. The farmers grew the poppy. Someone else made it a problem. International pressure, driven primarily by the United States government, facing a domestic political crisis around heroin availability in American cities, culminated in a complete Turkish ban on opium poppy cultivation in 1971 under Prime Minister Süleyman Demirel. The economic impact was immediate and devastating. An estimated 100,000 Anatolian farming families lost their primary income source in a single season. Fields that had been planted continuously for 3 centuries went empty. A landscape defined by purple and white bloom through spring became, overnight, a landscape of prohibited memory. The ban lasted 3 years. It was reversed in 1974 when it became undeniable that the primary effect had been to redirect the global heroin supply from licensed Anatolian processors to unlicensed Afghan ones, while doing nothing measurable to reduce drug use in American cities. The geopolitical calculation had failed on its own stated terms. 100,000 families had paid the price of its failure. Relegalization came with conditions. Farmers must register each field with the Toprak Masalari Office, the Soil Products Office. Harvesting is monitored from seed to capsule. The latex is extracted by state processors only. Unlicensed planting of a single poppy plant in a private garden carries criminal penalties under Turkish narcotics law. The seed, however, is legal. The hashish on your simit this morning came from the same capsule whose latex, unharvested, would constitute a criminal act. The line between them is a state license. Nothing else. It looks identical to a sweet almond. It grows on the same tree. It smells, when crushed, like marzipan, warm, sweet, almost comforting. Eat 12 of them, and the cyanide content is sufficient to kill an adult. The bitter almond is native to Anatolia, the wild progenitor of the sweet almond that now feeds the world. It grows in the rocky hillsides and river valleys of the Aegean and Mediterranean coast, flowering in pale pink in February before any other tree on the hillside has stirred. The nuts are identical to their sweet cousins in size, in shape, and the papery skin that comes away between the fingers. They smell identical. The difference is invisible until the moment it is not, which is the precise quality that makes this tree one of the most quietly dangerous plants in the Anatolian landscape. The compound responsible is amygdalin, a cyanogenic glycoside that metabolizes in the human digestive system into hydrogen cyanide. The bitter almond contains 40 to 70 times the amygdalin concentration of sweet almond varieties. Historically, Anatolian communities use tiny quantities of bitter almond oil in cooking and folk medicine. The flavor it contributes is real, the traditional applications are documented, and the margin between a culinary quantity and a lethal dose is extraordinarily, unforgivingly narrow. Documented poisoning cases in rural Aegean and Mediterranean communities, children mistaking bitter for sweet almonds during harvest season, when both fall from adjacent trees into the same basket, appear in Ottoman medical literature as early as the 18th century. The confusion is not negligence. It is the logical consequence of a plant that evolved to look exactly like something safe, in an environment where the safe version grows within arm's reach. Following the establishment of the Turkish Republic, the 1952 Turkish Food Codex formally prohibited the sale of raw bitter almonds in markets and restricted bitter almond oil to licensed industrial processing only. A 2011 revision to the Turk Gıda Kodexi tightened restrictions further, bringing Turkey into alignment with EU Regulation 1334/2008, which caps bitter almond flavoring in food products at 0.5 milligrams of hydrocyanic acid per kilogram. The tree itself is not banned. It still grows wild across the Aegean hillsides, flowering every February in the same pale pink as its sweet cousin, indistinguishable at a distance. It is cultivated by licensed processors for essential oil extraction. Bitter almond oil is a legitimate industrial ingredient, appearing in flavoring compounds, cosmetics, and pharmaceutical preparations around the world. But for the farmer who harvests it without a processing license, selling the raw nut at market carries criminal liability under Turkish food safety law. The tree is protected. The nut is prohibited. The flower is beautiful. 12 of them is the number. Researchers have verified it. 12 bitter almonds, consumed by an adult of average weight in a single sitting. The tree does not advertise this. It is one of the most prized fruits in the Mediterranean world. Deep crimson flesh, a flavor that sits between orange and raspberry, a pigment so vivid it looks like something is wrong with it. In 1837, Sultan Mahmud II banned its import entirely. The reason had nothing to do with taste, and everything to do with what was hiding inside the shipments. The blood orange, Malta portocali, arrived in Ottoman port cities through Maltese and Sicilian trading vessels in the early decades of the 19th century. Its flesh ranges from deep ruby to almost black red depending on cold exposure during ripening, the anthocyanin pigments that give it that color producing a juice that stains a glass like wine. Istanbul's elite had developed a taste for it. Merchants stocked it in the covered bazaars of Kapalı at a considerable premium. It was a luxury import with an established market and a growing reputation, exactly the kind of commodity the Ottoman trading system was designed to move in volume. The problem arrived in 1836. Not in the fruit itself, but in the wooden crates and soil packing material traveling with the shipments. Mediterranean fruit fly larvae, Ceratidis capitata, were identified by Ottoman agricultural inspectors in blood orange imports at the port of Istanbul. The larvae had already spread to citrus trees in the Aegean coastal regions before the contamination was traced back to its source. The fruit had been the vessel. The pest had been the cargo. By imperial firman dated 1837, Sultan Mahmud II issued a prohibition on the import of fresh blood orange produce from Maltese and Sicilian traders into Ottoman ports, one of the earliest documented phytosanitary trade bans in the region's recorded history. The ban was enforced through the Ottoman customs apparatus at Istanbul, Izmir, and Beirut, with confiscation and destruction of non-compliant shipments ordered at point of entry. It remained in partial effect under successive sultans until the late Tanzimat reform period of the 1860s, when regulated inspection replaced outright prohibition. What makes this entry remarkable is not the ban itself. It is the precision of the thinking behind it. In 1837, before the germ theory of disease had been formalized, before modern phytosanitary science existed as a discipline, an Ottoman inspection system identified a specific pest in a specific import, traced its movement from port to coastal orchard, and issued a targeted trade prohibition calibrated to its origin. The mechanism was imperfectly understood. The response was structurally correct. Turkey today grows blood oranges commercially, primarily in Adana, Mersin, and the Cukurova Plain, and exports them legally across the region. The Mediterranean fruit fly threat is managed through the modern inspection system of the Darim v. Ormanbakanligi. Fresh blood orange imports from specific at-risk origins still face seasonal inspection restrictions under current Turkish plant health regulations. The logic is identical to Sultan Mahmud's Firman of 1837. The institution is different. The calculation has not changed in 200 years. Turkey produces 70% of the world's hazelnuts. Entire coastal communities in the Black Sea region, Giresun, Ordu, Trabzon, depend on it entirely. Their economy, their identity, their agricultural calendar for generations. And for most of the 20th century, a single wild shrub growing in the hedgerows alongside every hazelnut orchard was quietly helping a fungal disease dismantle the crop from within. The wild dog rose is beautiful. It grows along the terraced hillsides of the Karadeniz coast in dense, flowering hedgerows, small white and pink blooms in early summer, bright red rose hips appearing in autumn as the hazelnut harvest begins. Rural communities have used those hips for centuries. Kasperna K. Rose Hip Tea is one of Turkey's most beloved winter drinks, sold in every market, brewed in every home from the Black Sea coast to the Anatolian interior. The plant looks medicinal. It looks harmless. For the people living alongside it, it was part of the landscape in the same way the terrace slopes and the sea fog were part of the landscape. Ancient, unremarkable, simply there. The disease it was carrying is called hazelnut downy mildew, caused by the pathogen Piranhaspora sparsa and a related complex of fungal spore diseases that use the wild dog rose as an alternate host to complete their reproductive cycle. In the presence of wild rose hedgerows, these diseases spread exponentially through hazelnut orchards, causing leaf curl, premature nut drop, and catastrophic yield loss. The rose was not sick. The rose was never sick. It carried the pathogen through its own reproductive cycle without visible symptom or damage, a perfect biological vehicle, invisible, continuous, seasonal, operating in a hedgerow directly beside the most commercially important crop on the coast. Beginning in the 1960s, Turkish agricultural scientists at the Fındık Araştırma Enstitüsü, the Hazelnut Research Institute in Giresun, identified the wild rose connection and began issuing regional phytosanitary clearance orders. By the 1970s, mandatory eradication of wild dog rose from designated hazelnut protection zones was codified into Turkish agricultural regulation. Farmers who refused faced crop inspection refusal and loss of state subsidy access, effectively a financial death sentence in a region where hazelnut cultivation was the only economy that existed. The hedgerows came down. The rose hip tea continued, sourced from cultivated varieties, not wild hedgerow stock, the industry careful to maintain that legal distinction. But the wild plant that had defined the texture of the Karadeniz hillside for centuries was reclassified, in its ancestral habitat, as an agricultural threat. The landscape that replaced it was cleaner, more productive, and significantly more fragile. A monoculture hazelnut coast that today faces accelerating soil degradation and pollinator decline that the hedgerows it replaced had quietly been preventing. The rose was removed to save the harvest. The harvest was saved. What the harvest is standing on now is a different question. The dog rose destroyed through invisibility, season after season, spore by wind-borne spore, damage accumulating beneath a surface that looked completely healthy. Our next entry did its damage once publicly and left a mark on the imperial record that survived 2 centuries. It is the oldest cultivated grapevine in Anatolia, pressed into wine before the Ottomans, before Byzantium, before Rome ever tasted it. It also became the most suppressed agricultural product in the final decades of the Ottoman Empire, systematically destroyed by state order. Not because of what it produced, because of who was producing it. The Carrara grape grows in thick-skinned clusters, deep purple-black, almost blue in the right light. The flesh is dense, the juice dark as ink. Fermented, it produces a wine so full-bodied and mineral-rich, drawing from the volcanic basalt soil around Diyarbakir. Mardin and Tur Abdin were abandoned, seized, or deliberately destroyed. What had been 40,000 cultivated acres of Kara-Erik in 1890 was reduced. By the time scholars at the Slow Food Foundation for Biodiversity conducted their assessment in 2008, to fewer than 12 certified heritage rootstocks surviving into the 21st century. 12. From 40,000 acres. The arithmetic of that reduction is not a natural history. It is a political one. The Turkish Republic never formally rebanned the Kara-Erik grape, but restrictions on winemaking under successive governance pressures and the absence of state agricultural support kept it effectively suppressed through most of the 20th century. Since 2010, a small revival effort has been underway in Diyarbakir province, where local cooperatives are attempting to restore certified heritage rootstock under geographical indication protection. The vine is coming back slowly, in the hands of people who understand what was taken and why. Fewer than 12 rootstocks. From 40,000 acres. Every other entry in this countdown was restricted by science, by ecology, by the chemistry of a seed or the biology of a spore. This one was restricted by a decision about which people were allowed to remain in a landscape and which were not. That is where this countdown ends. 10 plants. 10 stories from the soil of Anatolia, one of the oldest continuously farmed landscapes on Earth. A place where the question of what grows here and who decides has been asked and answered and contested and overturned for 10,000 years without arriving at a final answer. Some of what you just heard will send a farmer to court this growing season. The buffer zone law that arrived at Mehmet's neighbor's gate is not a historical artifact. It is active, enforced, and expanding. Some of the plants on this list are spreading right now, past the boundaries drawn to contain them, indifferent to the classifications that follow them into the regulatory record. Some are nearly gone, reduced to 12 rootstocks, to a handful of cooperative plots, to the memory of a landscape that existed before an empire decided to simplify it. And some are in your cup right now. The rose hip tea brewed in Black Sea kitchens every winter comes from a plant the government has been trying to clear from its ancestral habitat for 60 years. The hasha's seed on the simmet you bought this morning sits above a root system whose latex, unharvested, would constitute a criminal act. The prickly pear being sold from a cart on the Aegean seafront this August is the fruit of an invasive species that 4 centuries ago arrived without invitation and has never once been asked to leave in a language it understood. The garden in Anatolia was never innocent. Neither was the law that drew the line around it. What this countdown has not resolved, and will not resolve because the history does not resolve it, is whether the lines were right. The science behind most of them is sound. The fungal diseases are real. The ecological displacement is documented. The cyanide content of 12 bitter almonds is not a metaphor. And yet the same regulatory apparatus that protects a wheat harvest from invisible spores also, in the right political climate, burned the vineyards of communities it had decided to remove. The mechanism is identical. The justification changes depending on who is holding the pen. Farmers in Diyarbakir are still quietly tending Kara-Erik vines that probably should not be there, by the letter of a history that tried to erase them. The wild dog rose is still growing in the hedgerows that were supposed to have been cleared 60 years ago. Its hips red in October, its spores doing what they have always done. And every August, along the Aegean coast, people are still buying prickly pear from a plant that arrived 4 centuries ago and has never once been persuaded that its presence here requires permission, which says everything about how humans relate to the land they love. The land does not negotiate. The law does. And in that gap between what the state orders and what actually grows back is where every story on this channel lives. Which one sat with you longest? Tell us below. This is the Anatolian Peasant Farmers channel. We'll see you in the next field.